Welcome back to part 3 of the FAST LSXR 102 intake manifold upgrade for the LS2 powered C6. In part 1, we talked about how the LS2 stock intake manifold is generally considered to be the worst cathedral port intake manifold GM ever made, and how the FAST intake manifold is generally agreed upon as being one of the best cathedral port intake manifolds made. Therefore, it just seems to make sense to swap out the most restrictive manifold for one of the most free-flowing manifolds, and how that hopefully should yield a pretty nice power gain. Then we proceeded to remove the stock LS2 intake manifold and document the procedure step by step. In part 2, we took a look at the stock LS2 intake and the FAST intake side by side on the bench and made some observations about the more noticeable differences between the two manifolds. It's times like this that I really wish that I had a flow bench. Then we proceeded with the full installation of the FAST intake on the LS2, and of course we documented the procedure step by step. I also answered a couple of questions from the comment sections in part 1 and 2, specifically why didn't I choose to go with the ported version of the FAST intake manifold, and why did I elect to retain the stock 85mm throttle body as opposed to upgrading to a larger 102mm throttle body. You'll find links to part 1 and part 2 right up here in case you want to watch those videos before continuing with this one. Now let's finally continue with the fun stuff, and that's the testing, the tuning, and the evaluation of the hopefully new and improved version of the LS2 powered C6 Corvette.
Toys for life.
The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and take the C6 on a spirited street drive under various situations and scenarios to see if I can notice a difference. Now, admittedly, this is not a very scientific test. In fact, it's 100% subjective, but it's a lot of fun, so I'm going to do it anyway, even though I won't place a whole lot of faith in the results. Now, part of the fun of doing these videos is that it gives me excuses to go ahead and take the C5 and the C6 out for test drives to evaluate changes. And so my first observations were that it does seem a little bit faster, definitely not slower, but if it is faster, it's not by much. So think about this for just 1 second. Even if the LS2 did pick up the full 20 horsepower that I'm hoping for, that's only a 5% increase in horsepower, and in my opinion, that's just really not enough for anyone to accurately perceive. And so the results of this test are, as you may have predicted, possibly an increase in horsepower, but inconclusive. Now let's look at a much more objective way of trying to determine if the LS2 has picked up some additional horsepower. And to do that, I'm going to take a look at a wide open throttle scan taken before the intake manifold installation and compare it with another scan that was taken after the installation of the FAST intake. To try to be as scientific as possible and to reduce variables, both of these scans were taken on the same stretch of road on days that had roughly the same weather, which resulted in intake air temperatures that were about the same. And for the serious drag racers and pilots out there, the density altitude of the before run was 3,418 feet, and the density altitude for the after run was 3,324 feet. This first scan is showing the injector duty cycle at each RPM before the intake was installed, and the next scan shows the injector duty cycle after the intake was installed. Here I've inputted both of these injector duty cycle tables into a spreadsheet, and since I don't care about just 1 RPM, I averaged the injector pulse width between 4,500 and 6,375 RPMs so that we end up with a number that includes multiple RPMs. As you can see, the average injector pulse width with the fast intake is 4.8% higher than the number without the fast intake, which, when multiplied by the LS2's stock 400 horsepower, equals roughly a 19.2 horsepower gain. As it turns out, that is about the same horsepower that numerous others have reported. Now, although this is an objective test, I know it is by no means perfect, and I doubt such a perfect test actually exists. Even if we had baselined the car on a dyno and then came back a couple days later with the fast intake installed, we likely would have some differences that really can't be accounted for, even with the SAE adjustments. That all having been said, this is my best attempt at a very cost-efficient and somewhat objective test, and I think the data is definitely worth considering. So in my opinion, it definitely points to the fast intake manifold, giving the LS2 roughly 15 to 20 horsepower. Now let's take a look at the final test that I'm going to use to evaluate the fast intake's horsepower addition. It also happens to be the test that is the most fun. It costs a little bit more, but again, it's pretty objective, and as a lot of people say, the numbers don't lie. Earlier this year, I took the C6 out to Rock Falls Raceway to get some good baseline drag strip data. Now, as you may recall, I'm not very interested in the elapsed time because that's more indicative of a really good launch, drag radial tires, and beating the daylights out of the clutch. Instead, I'm very interested in the mile per hour that the C6 achieves at the end of the quarter mile, because that is essentially a function of the weight of the vehicle and how much horsepower the engine is producing. So after making several passes down the quarter mile with the C6 a few months back before the fast intake was installed, the best pass that I made achieved a speed of 113.98 miles per hour. Fast forward to just about a week ago, and I made a bunch of passes once again at Rock Falls Raceway, and this time after the fast intake manifold was installed. My best mile per hour was 115.64. That's an improvement of 1.66 miles per hour, which doesn't sound like much, but the question really is, how much horsepower does it take to add 1.66 miles per hour to a 3,450 pound car with me in it in the quarter mile? Now, I'm not smart enough to do all the calculations and come up with the correct number, but luckily for me, there are racing calculators that can. Per TCI Automotive's racing calculator, a car like the C6 that achieves 115.64 miles per hour in the quarter takes about 416.4 horsepower, while a car that only achieves 113.98 miles per hour requires 398.7 horsepower. That is a 17.7 horsepower difference, which incidentally is in the ballpark of the 20 horsepower approximately that we're thinking the fast intake adds to a stock LS2. Now, to be as scientific as possible, we need to take into consideration the quality of the air that existed on the day we did the testing before the fast intake manifold installation, as compared to the quality of the air that existed on the day we did the testing after the fast intake installation. We also need to take into account the wind speed and which direction the wind is coming from on each of those days of testing, and how they relate to the direction the car is traveling down the drag strip. Unfortunately, I do have the air quality data for both testing days, and we'll use the density altitude numbers for that. And I also have the wind speed and direction data as well. Here we've got the overall map of Rock Falls Raceway. North is up, and the racetrack runs from the west to the east with a definite slight slant to the south. I've included a half of a compass here with all of the degrees so we can see exactly which way the wind was coming from on the 2 different test days. So on the left here, we've got the testing that was done before the FAST was installed, and we achieved 113.98 miles per hour. We did have a slight 10 mile per hour wind. It didn't really have a great angle on the car, so it didn't help a lot, but it probably helped a little bit. And on the post-FAST install test day, we had a 7 mile an hour headwind that had a pretty good angle on the car, so it definitely slowed the car down by a little bit, but by how much, I'm not sure. And on the bottom line here, we've got the density altitude, and the air was definitely better on the post-FAST install test day by 800 feet versus the testing we did before installing the manifold. At the end of the day, the testing that I did after the installation of the FAST intake was hindered by the wind, but helped by the air quality. And keep in mind that wind is not always steady, there's often gusts, and there may be other less critical factors at play that I haven't taken into consideration. As a reality check and to kind of help frame my test results, here's a list taken from the Corvette forum where their members with stock LS2 C6s self-reported their quarter mile results. I think there's enough data here and it's of a sufficient sample size, and if anything, I think the list is probably biased towards the fast side. I think this way because I believe as the list got started and began to grow, if forum members got a fast time at the drag strip, they definitely reported it. And if they went to the drag strip and ran a pokey time, they might have kept it to themselves. As you can see, there is a lot of variability in this list, and it's because it's from Corvette forum members across the United States with no correction given for different track elevations, different track temperatures, different wind conditions, and of course, driver ability. So where does my C6 fall on this list? Well, from the testing I did earlier this year before the FAST intake, I placed near the bottom with one of the higher mile per hour speeds in the quarter mile. With the FAST intake installed, my mile per hour is now faster than all of the other cars on this stock LS2 list, as it should be. And I think this just helps confirm that the magnitude of change that my relatively stock LS2 has received from the FAST intake is in the ballpark of what might have been expected. Now for the million-dollar question, was the installation of the FAST LSXR 102 intake manifold on my LS2 powered C6 worth it? On the one hand, it's quite an expensive modification, and really the effects are barely noticeable for everyday driving. And on the other hand, with just about every modification I can think of, especially aftermarket camshafts, there's always going to be trade-offs with some downside. But with the FAST intake manifold, I can't think of a single downside trade-off. What about tuning? Is a new tune required? Well, my C6's tune was pretty well dialed in from before, and I didn't really need to make any changes, and I suspect that'll be the same thing with most stock LS2 tunes. That having been said, I would always recommend that if you install an intake like this, that you do some scanning of part throttle and wide open throttle operation just to be sure, and that can be accomplished with either HP tuners or a high quality scan tool like my AutoFix D1 Lite. So what's next for the Toys for Life LS2 powered C6? I'm not exactly sure, but I need your help. Leave a comment below if you think I should do heads, a cam, headers, or perhaps rear end gears or something else. While you're at it, please hit that thumbs up button and consider a super thanks donation to help fund these highly detailed installation and testing videos. And most of all, thanks for watching.